Morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to another Redline Twitter Spaces. This one focusing on the recent protests in Mongolia. Effectively, we've seen the government house almost stormed. We've seen protests in multiple cities across the country, and yet there is not a lot of reporting on the subject. So, Redline doing the obscure countries we love to talk about. Thought we'd jump in and do a bit of a deep dive on what's going on in Mongolia and how it's likely to impact the region. And joining us today is Anand Tumurtogoo from BNE Journalism, as well as a freelance reporter based in Ulaanbaatar, and the always fantastic Julian Dierkes from the University of British Columbia, who is a alumni of the Red Line previously when he came in to do our Mongolia episode a while ago now. So I'm going to throw this first question to Anand. What are these protests about? Why are they kicking off? And are these protests big or standard or even smaller for what Mongolia usually goes through?
Okay. First of all, thank you, Michael, for inviting me to be on the show. Yes, this protest has been one of the biggest in terms of size for probably a decade or so. And I think there was a recent report that these protests have reached, on average, about 2,600 people per day. That was the average. And I would say that for the majority of the protests, this has never happened before. And can you add more things to it, Julian?
So yeah, Julian, you've been following Mongolia for a long time. How do these protests stack up to particularly the ones we saw earlier on in the year in February and April, and protests even since independence? Is this standard procedure for Mongolia or something big and new?
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for organizing this. Of course, first I have to object to the characterization of obscure countries. We're talking about the world's most interesting place, so nothing obscure about Mongolia at all. But in the meantime, how to sort of situate these protests? I mean, one of the things, you could just go sort of for very superficial basics first, which is it's December and it's really cold. There is sort of a cyclical seasonality to protests in Mongolia, and they're much more common in the spring. April is usually the season. Even if you go as far back as 32 years ago to the Democratic Revolution, that sort of was brewing over the winter, but then reached ahead in the spring. And so pretty surprising to see people out. It's been pretty cold this December too, so not an obvious time for people to go out on the street. And so I think that signals how much passion there would have been behind the protesters. I point to that. The other piece is the one that you asked about, Michael, which is that we already had a set of larger protests in April that seemed, I think, Anand, you'd probably agree, that had a similar sort of demographic to it, in that it was largely younger people and seemed to be sort of more or less spontaneously coming out of what, though, a bigger sense of frustration with lack of delivery of some of the promises by the government, right? And so within, what does that make it, 8 months since April, we've had sort of a revisit of a similar set of demonstrations, just hinting that there's a longer term, larger piece going on beyond the immediate trigger that were these corruption investigations right now.
Yes, exactly. For the April.
So now, can you take us through these corruption investigations? Effectively, this all kicked off with information coming out about a bunch of coal being stolen from Mongolia, which Mongolia's made a lot of money off coal this particular year, with the price being quite high and China's demand being very high. Can you take us through how this information actually came out and what was actually stolen?
So initially, this protest came about when the information of almost. So in Mongolian terms, it would be around like 44 trillion tug. So that's roughly around $12 billion have been basically stolen from all these exports. And the information actually came about from the government, from government officials, that there was this kind of like a coal mafia people that have been embezzling a lot of the exports, and they've been exporting coal through the borders as if they were hauling coal trucks empty, but they actually had coal inside them. But this theft seems to be going on since 2011, when Mongolia was becoming as a term of Mongolia, where the world had a lot of interest in Mongolia, where we showed to have a lot of prospects in mining. And from then on, there was just a slew of small, like export crimes of coal throughout the years. And this coal theft was first brought up by one politician in 2018, where the politician actually got insider information, basically got an insider information by a whistleblower in 2016, and basically brought up into Parliament. It was not very widely discussed, or nobody really cared about it at that time. And I don't know why at this time this took steam. I think the government wanted to show that they were actually fighting something, that they basically wanted to show to the public they were doing something, that they were fighting crime, and they dealt their hand. But in return, they got a huge blowback from the public, from a lot of things of high inflation, also poor living standards, all mixed in together with this scandal of coal theft intertwined. And that's basically how the protests come about, basically.
Michael, let me just add to that what Anand is speaking about. And first of all, let me welcome my very good and old dear friend Sophie to the conversation. But one of the interesting things about the government sort of admitting to this corruption was that Anand, I think it's been bubbling up all fall, right? Because earlier on, the government already took steps to put the management of Tumurtogoo, which is the state-owned coal company that's implicated in all this, under sort of special observation, shall we say, which hinted that they clearly were aware that there were shenanigans going on.
Yes.
I guess, right? I guess we didn't quite know how far back they were going to go. And my initial suspicion was that we were primarily looking at last year, when the coal exports finally ramped up again after the border to China reopened, and that there was a sense of coal really being the only, I don't know, the only economic game in town. And so people jumping on that opportunity. But the government clearly had a sense that something was going on, already intervened with management at Tumurtogoo, and then finally sort of fessed up in early December to say, okay, no, there really is something going on. But it wasn't terribly surprising at that point, right?
Yes, it wasn't. Basically, the people looked at this and said and thought that you already knew about this and you are probably involved in these crimes yourself, basically, and pointing the finger at the government itself. Basically, the government became almost like what do you call those tales of the boy who cried wolf, and they didn't want to take any kind of sympathy towards the government, revealing this fact of corruption that was happening for a very long time.
So if the government has brought it forward, though, surely this is going to blow back on the government. So do you think this is them worried the story was going to come out anyway and get ahead of it? Or frankly, this might be even political maneuvering within Ulaanbaatar? Why would the government be releasing such a damning story that would blow back on their administration?
I think there's one thing I see from this is that our economy is not doing well because of the war and also the border closures to the south because of China's zero COVID policy. And I think they just wanted to showcase that they were actually doing something, that they were actually doing something to protect the people and try to help the people, that they were actually fighting corruption, try to get brownie points from the public when our economy is doing fairly poorly at the moment. And they didn't expect this much of a blowback, in my perspective.
I guess the other piece to that, Michael, too, is that as the reaction that the government showed then last week was, not entirely surprisingly, that the current government is the Mongolian People's Party, and they quickly pointed the finger to previous governments, as governments are wont to do, right? And so, you might also think about this as an opportunity to finger particularly former President Batulak and his involvement in some of this as maybe a political opportunity the government might have seen if they saw revelations coming in any case perhaps they figured they might as well get on top of things and investigate thoroughly, with the hopes of pointing to previous office holders rather than having it all blamed on themselves.
So, Julian, Anand mentioned there about the fact the war is impacting the local economy, is really hurting people. Can you take us through what impacts you're seeing, or what in the larger economy and larger scale of the region have been impacted by the war at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, the most immediate impact. There's two impacts. There's one that's via sanctions, right? That Mongolia didn't really join. But because the sanctions are so widespread across the international community, obviously excluding China as its big trading partner, but that hasn't had an impact on Mongolia, particularly on the banking sectors, right? And they needed to scramble to figure out how to be able to transfer foreign funds and all that sort of thing. I mean, when I was in Mongolia last month, one of the interesting things people talked about is, and I don't know if you've heard this, Anand, but about tools selling out in local hardware stores because these Russians who'd fled the draft across the border and come into Mongolia, I guess, were setting themselves up with tools for some reason.
Yes, I heard that.
So there's sort of, right? So there's the sort of smaller impacts like that. I think what we're seeing with this coal corruption, though, is much more an impact of COVID border closures by the Chinese, not by the Russians, and rather than an impact of sort of the fallout from Russian aggression against Ukraine, where in the initial year of COVID in 2020, that Mongolia managed fairly well until November. Partly because there are so few entry points to Mongolia. So managed well in terms of infections, but of course struggled because the Chinese government shut down borders, right? And what that meant was also that Mongolia's financial lifeline, which is minerals exports to China, was literally cut off, right? Both copper and also coal. And so we saw last year really towards throughout 2021, but into 2022 as well, when the Chinese regime started reopening border crossings, then Mongolian companies scrambling to deliver pent up stock of primarily of copper at that point. And that's sort of this situation of it's not quite desperation, but an urge to deliver into China, I think has opened some space for even more corrupt practices than might have been happening longer term.
So when I looked at footage of the protests, one of the first things you notice is how young everyone is. Most people with these protests are under the age of 30, and there's a lot of students in there as well. Why are these protesters so young compared to sort of the average population in Mongolia? And is that an indication that the younger population in Mongolia is very civically engaged, or frankly, this is one of the first times they might have been engaged in politics in recent times?
So there are a few things. For the younger generation, they are more tech savvy, or they know they can get a lot of information abroad. And also at the moment that the young people are seeing that their prospects of future is not there, basically, that they're living in a society where they study and then they can't find jobs, and even if they do get jobs, that the living standards are so poor that they can't even dream of living a good life in Mongolia. And one of the things that the young people usually always brought up was that my dream should not be to go work in a foreign country as a laborer, as a minimum wage worker, to make a dream in my own country, basically. So the young people's dreams are basically to leave Mongolia, to find actually have a financial security in other foreign countries, maybe Australia or in Korea, to do minimum wage jobs, very harsh conditions, and accumulate their wealth and come back, basically. And they don't want that, basically. They see that as very like, how can I say, like very dark, almost like a very horrible story, like a very horrible dark story that they're living in. And that's one of the things that the young people are very frustrated about. And I think COVID and also the border closures affected that immensely, because one of the things also, aside from exports, import is also very dependent on China. And one of the reasons why our inflation rose to the 15 or to 18% was that we couldn't import all of the foods from China. Like 80% of our food security is based upon Chinese imports. So that says a lot, and because of that, people couldn't afford a lot of the basic needs. Basically, there was reports of people buying bread on a half a loaf. They're cutting the breads in half and basically borrowing it from stores to pay back later. So that was basically the dire situation that Mongolians were living in, and young people saw that, and they see that things are getting even worse, and that's why they protested in mass, and because of their basic frustration, I would say. I don't. So it wasn't basically because of their civic engagements. It's basically because of mostly on frustration that they couldn't live in a country that they're supposed to be free and supposed to be democratic when everything is just bleak.
So, Julian, one of the other, people think the protests will end and things will go back to normal, but looking at the recent budget put out by the Mongol government, that budget indicates that the Chinese are going to buy as much coal going forward from them and at the price that it currently is, which most commodities experts would suggest the demand for coal will ease a little bit as renewables come back on in Europe, and we're likely to see less coal being demanded from China in sort of the medium term. What's going to happen when China doesn't get as much coal? Is the Mongol budget ready for that shortfall? Or frankly, am I reading this wrong? And China is going to continue buying this much coal at this price in Mongolia?
I don't have any particular, I don't have a crystal ball on the coal price or demand, but I do think that some of the assumptions that the budget made that was passed in November are a bit heroic in terms of volume and price. But what's adding pressure to all of this is that a set of foreign currency bonds are coming due again for payment next year. And these go back to about 10 years ago when Mongolia was just entering its sort of boom times that Anand also referred to earlier. And so they took on some foreign debt, and that they're still having to get to pay off, because it was initially based on the assumption that revenue streams from the giant copper mine Tumurtogoo would start rolling in, and that has happened, but not to the extent that was expected. And so they've got these foreign debt payments to make. And so the budget makes some heroic assumptions, really kind of hoping that the coal sales will be strong and the price will be strong to be able to meet some of those debt obligations. I think there are heroic assumptions, and I don't think anyone's really expecting that to happen. What seems much more likely is that there'll be another round of negotiations with IMF next year to somehow restructure the debt and roll it over again. And so that the budget was really sort of well, if things go really well, we can manage this, we'll handle it, we'll make our payments. But perhaps more realistic is a version that'll say, well, there'll be some sales, hopefully, although even that's unclear, right? Because with the easing of no COVID by the Chinese regime, it's a bit unclear what that's going to mean economically, and whether that will lead to an increase or a decrease in economic activity, depending what the impact on China is going to be in terms of infections and everything else. And so, a lot of uncertainty there, and some foreign debt looming in the meantime.
So, Anand, the government that's currently in place in Mongolia was elected with a pretty big landslide. It was an 82% or around that number, election. It was a big win for them. Are people going to blame them for this, or are they going to likely put their blame more towards these coal riots, or put their blame towards COVID? Who are the people going to be pointing fingers at going forward?
I think they're going to blame their fingers at the current ruling party, because they promised a lot of things, and one of their promises that they made was that they would make Mongolia like a COVID-free country. And they kind of basically did that, and that's why they basically, I would say, like won the election, where Mongolia was one of the first few countries that did not have a local transmission, and mostly everything was relatively okay in our country at the beginning. So that was a huge plus. But as time goes on with how things are, we did have local infections, and things took a sharp turn, and the economy and people's mood and everything became almost very bleak. And one of the protests in 2020 2021 in February was because of the COVID policies that we had of almost very similar to what is happening in China, where we had mass lockdowns where we weren't allowing people to leave their homes, and that basically also took down the previous government, but now this government is still staying strong, even though the current two protests have been way larger than the February one in 2021.
So obviously, one of the big promises by this government is that they are putting together a working group to, name names and put people forward on who has actually been stealing this coal that caused the protests. Julian, that committee is meant to bring back results in 2 days' time. What results do you think they're going to bring? Do you think they're going to actually point fingers? And do you think that people will accept what's given?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, if the three of us were government accused of corruption, we would obviously reach for a committee, right? That's what you do. You form a committee and you investigate. And of course, these allegations need thorough investigation, right? One of the challenges is that the discourse around corruption in Mongolia often involves a lot of finger pointing, and everyone pretty much agreeing, well, that person is probably a bit shady, but rarely evidence being brought forward. And so in many ways, it's the right response, I think, by Parliament to say, look, we're going to have to investigate this thoroughly, and we want to get behind or into, who's involved, how this is actually working, and why it's happening as state-owned companies. So that's all fair. But if you're a protester sleeping on Supatra Square at minus 35 degrees, I'm not sure that the prime minister saying, hey, we'll form a committee is really going to placate a lot of that anger and that frustration. And so, and I'm also not entirely sure that as much as a thorough investigation would be good, that's actually going to happen, because it's been some years, really the last time I would say that we've seen these kind of investigations was in the small and medium enterprise loan fund, where parliamentarians gave their sort of fake companies big loans to pay out, and that was roughly, I think 5 years ago. It was 2017, I think. And so it's been a while where there actually has been this kind of follow-up, as desirable as it's been. And so I would be surprised if a lot of protesters are impressed by that as a response, even though it may well be the right bureaucratic response to take.
And what do you think is going to be handed down in the report in 2 days' time?
I also don't know, and I don't think, even if the report is positive, I don't think a lot of the people would be happy, because at the moment the protest is actually petering out, and there's only very few people on the square, and even though they're still sleeping outside in the cold, a lot of people are questioning their legitimacy. And a lot of people are questioning their demands, actually. So it's just it basically lost all of its steam and all of its main goals. And one of the reasons why is that happening is that because most Mongolians don't really have like a civic understanding of elections or like a civic engagement that they need to go through. Like for example, at the moment some of the protests are demanding very draconian methods to find justice, like to bring back the death penalty, and what else? There's few of those kind of sentiments that are not really democratic. It's very autocratic, and also they're talking about how we should dissolve parliament altogether and become like a presidential autocracy, where their justification is that at least one person would be stealing things, not like 76 parliamentarians. Mongolia has a 76 membership parliament, and one of those kind of justifications are very shows that these protesters are not really engaged in the civic process. And there have been a lot of civil rights groups and grassroots groups that have been trying to engage with these people and to give them advice, but they are actively shunning these people, and they're actually shunning like former politicians who are actually trying to give them like a good direction on what kind of direction they should go to. And some of the protesters are saying that we don't want this. We don't want this to become political, but protest is political. So it's just it's in a very Mongolian civic engagement is in a very dire situation, and then this protest is showing it in clear daylight, I would say.
So, Julian, obviously, I spend a lot of time reading Russian papers and Chinese papers and seeing how the world's reacting to things. And I can tell you, there's not been much reaction from the Russian or Chinese press about these protests. So, what has been the reaction from the governments in Beijing and Moscow? And are they taking these quite seriously? And do you think this might jeopardize, for instance, the new project by Russia to put a pipeline right through Mongolia to transport gas into China?
Well, I've got to admit, Michael, I don't read a lot of Russian newspapers. Are you having fun with that? I guess it's got to be sort of entertaining. And likewise, the quality of the Chinese.
I'm a masochist, It's got to leave, if I want to read a Russian newspaper, I know my day can only get better from there.
And the quality of the reporting in the Chinese media is about equally impressive. But yeah, I mean, there was a little interesting bit that happened right in the first week of these protests at the beginning of the month, where the foreign ministry spokeswoman of the Chinese regime was asked about these corruption allegations, because of course the buyers and presumably the bribers, right? I mean, there's someone on the Chinese side who's complicit with this and is part of these schemes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be working, because this is all coal being trucked, not yet railroaded, but trucked into China. So clearly the purchasers are Chinese. And so the Chinese foreign ministry spokeswoman was asked about these, and her reply was that, well, that obviously the Chinese government would, if asked by the Mongolian government, would provide and support evidence of any corrupt practices. And that was interesting because President Tumurtogoo had been in Beijing was a week before or 10 days before, right? Just very recently before that had been on a visit. And so there's sort of this suspicion maybe that information might have been exchanged during that visit that would have also prompted the Mongolian government then to go public when they did. But that really, there's not much follow-up to that. Now, again, I don't focus much of my attention on the Chinese regime to be able to say that I mean, obviously we've all read about anti-corruption campaigns led by Xi as part of his sort of consolidation of his power over the past many years. So are they maybe going after some Chinese actors there as well? I wouldn't be able to tell. But the longer term applications, and you mentioned the pipeline, I don't know. Not really. I don't think anyone's surprised to hear that there's corruption at state-owned enterprise mining companies in Mongolia. There's been obviously lots of allegations of corruption over the years. The perception is that this is a very corrupt space, particularly in the coal sector. Not just sort of regular everyday corruption that people might talk about having to bribe a police person or so, but sort of grand corruption at the scale is presumably rife. We assume the same thing to be the case for Russia and for China. And so this is a coming together of sectors that no one really expects to be particularly squeaky clean. And so I don't know, for the pipeline, there's not going to be much involvement by the Mongolians in the pipeline, right? The construction is going to be all Chinese, I assume. And the Russian side is simply just going to pipe some gas into the pipeline. And so I don't think there's big impacts there.
Yeah, I would like to add on that for the government have explicitly expressed that the Chinese side or any kind of foreign side was not involved in this corruption or scandal or this theft. It was just mostly internal, that most of the crime happened within the government and within the customs, and all of this theft came about is because the customs agencies did not really how can I say, like record all of these exports thoroughly, and was in cahoots with the thieves in general.
So, Anand, we have a question. We have a few questions coming in from our audience now, and if you have a question for our fantastic panel, you can DM the red line, and we can put them through to our panel. But this one's about transparency within Mongolia. Our question asker here suggested that Mongolia has been backsliding in its transparency over the last little while. Do you think the fact that the government's come forward with this is a reversing of course, and we are going to see a return to transparency inside Ulaanbaatar, or frankly, the trend is still downward for transparency within the country?
That's a good question. So the government has promised to be transparent on a lot of the things, but at the moment these are just basically like band-aids. And since 2017, actually, the Mongolian government have full control on what kind of information is deemed to be readily available to people. So they have been so previously the Mongolian government used to the 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 government, no, the parliament used to classify what should be top secret and what can be readily available. And since 1990 till 2016, the classified information in Mongolia was 60, and after 2017, that number actually ballooned to like 600. So a lot of the government is basically they can amend things, they can deem what kind of things are basically classified, and they've been classifying a lot of ridiculous things over the years of what can be what is actually top classified and what is actually a national security risk. Like for example, I think in 2019 there was a few conscripts who were actually helping build the railways of this whole scandal, and one of the government officials actually deemed the number of soldiers or the trainees as secret, but he spoke candidly about the numbers to a local press, and he was never punished for it, and it's just a total mess of what is actually a secret and what is not, and what local NGOs and grassroots organizations are saying is that most of these of classifying of information is to not to show themselves in a bad light. Basically, they're basically hiding their bad actions, and they don't want to look bad in front of the public, to look good in front of the people. And if you have a lot of bad information, you have a lot of critics from NGOs, like journalists, and they've been clamping on that for almost since 2017, and has made it very difficult for people to actually to look into the government and what they're doing. And we do actually have like a freedom of information law, but that law has been passed in 2011, and there's a lot of loopholes, and the government have used that loopholes to hide things. And it's supposed to be amended, and it's supposed to be fixed. A lot of NGOs have been trying to amend those, but it's basically been stalled in Parliament, and it has not had an open hearing for a long time.
So, Julian, let's say these protests. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll add, let me add to that real quick, Michael. I mean, the piece that Anand, I think, identifies that's really important is that what we're talking about in this coal scandal here is an SOE, right? Is a state-owned company, and it's ironic, of course, because in many ways, state-owned companies ought to serve the people better than private companies, because they would have different aims, right? But it's in fact turned out not to be that way. And this business about state secrecy that Anand identified is really important, because there's a lot of areas where Mongolian transparency legislation is actually quite progressive, or shall we say far-reaching. So, for example, there's a glass accounts law that specifies basically, and this is aimed particularly at the resource sector, that anyone can look at the accounts of a corporate entity to be able to look at payments and how they've moved around. And that actually has been used relatively little, but is in principle there, but these SOEs are being shielded from that kind of scrutiny. And I think that's part of the reaction, and maybe even the disgust, or why people are pointing at a cold sort of mafia, saying, well, this clearly is some kind of a scheme within the government to exempt itself from the transparency requirements that may be more relevant to some of the private actors. But Michael, you were asking a different thing. Go ahead.
So let's say the report comes out 2 days from now, and it says that Bob, Tim, and Eric, the guys who are in charge of the scheme, we're putting them all in jail. This whole scheme is going to go behind us. Do you think that ends the protests and ends the problems, or frankly, there's a lot more systemic problems under the surface here And no matter even if we do convict half a dozen people out of this corruption investigation, Mongolia's problems are still going to be there for a while.
Yeah, all of the above. I think we will see, whether it's in this immediate version of the report or further on, there certainly will be people identified. I think former President Batulak is a strong contender to have himself being identified for corrupt practices. They will be identified, but that's not going to make the problem go away. And it's unclear to me that this current government or a previous or the Democratic Party governments as they've existed in the past really has quite the will to examine their own practices regarding state-owned enterprises very carefully. There's still an unresolved debate about why is the government involved in certain sectors, towards what purpose, and towards what benefits does that actually bring to the people? And that question remains relatively unresolved from my perspective, at least, and would need to be resolved to then also go after some of these governance issues in these companies that are ultimately to blame for some of these corrupt practices. If you look at Tumurtogoo, which is the coal miner at the center of all this, the state-owned enterprise, it's not just a corrupt place, it's also just has a poor reputation in terms of environmental practices and local visibility and the like. I mean, it's operating in the Tumurtogoo deposit where the other big operator is a private company, and its reputation is significantly better. It's a private Mongolian operator, but it's as a corporate citizen, it's behaving much better than the government firm, which as I said is sort of ironic. And so I think those issues do remain unresolved. But I also suspect, I mean, Anand already mentioned that the protests seem to be petering out, and some of that is just simply climate, right? It's just not protest season, and they haven't grown to the extent that there's a big movement emerging. There's no organization to these protests that would suggest a larger movement, and so I do think they are set to peter out. There'll be some repercussions for particular individuals. There will be some more investigations, I hope, that will also lead to publicly available proof of corrupt practices, but there'll be a whole lot of issues that will remain unresolved.
And Anand, the same question to you. If these reports come back and we arrest a few people, does it solve the problem? And do you think the protesters will be happy with that?
I have no idea if the people will be happy. I think at the moment, the people have just basically given up. Most of the people have given up. There's only very few people at the square protesting. And again, their messaging is not clear. Their demands are not clear. The demands are very draconian and very undemocratic in a sense. And a lot of people have criticized the protesters. And these protesters could have gotten some organization and could have gotten some legitimacy, but they don't want this protest to become political. And in that sense, it just becomes like almost like a show, almost like a popularity contest at this moment. And it's a very harsh thing to say, but in reality, it's basically turning out that way as we speak. And even our justice minister spoke today that he does not understand what these protesters actually want, and that is a very good signal that the government does not really care about the protesters anymore. I think they wanted to do what they wanted to do, to prosecute or to blame the people, political actors they didn't like, and they will proceed with that, and they will probably not yield. Maybe yield some portion towards the protesters, but not a significant one that will have a grand effect on Mongolia's overall system of corruption and political instability or like political corruptions.
Honestly, a huge thanks to both of you for jumping on the panel. I'm going to do one quick last 90-second. Where do you see the Mongolia going in the next sort of couple of months? Do you think we'll be back here talking about more protests once the weather comes back up, or frankly, this is probably Mongolia's protest for a little while? And quick 90-second to wrap up. Julian first.
There's always more protests in Mongolia. After the protest is before the next protest. I'm sure we'll see some in April when it's protest season again. There's lots of things to protest around, and it's a relatively free public space, so people are able to protest. other thing that's going to happen next year at some point, I think Oyenerden, the prime minister's, his days are numbered. This was just another indication of him not being strong enough, I think, to go through the election in 2024. And hopefully we'll see some evidence from these corruption investigations coming in the next year. Over to you, Anand.
I think so. One of the reasons why the government was really afraid of this protest is because it was very big. It was one of the biggest. The April was also big, and that protest was very peaceful. And this one also was relatively peaceful, but the protest did try to storm the government palace, and they did break fences. And I think if the government does not show any kind of progress towards justice or to make lives of Mongolians better, I think we will see another protest that will be more violent, more chaotic, and probably. I don't want to see this, but it might affect our country as a whole, as a democratic country. But I don't want to see that. But that's just my negative way of seeing things.